Good morning, everybody. Before we start, I would just like to apologize on behalf of Alex, who has to leave at 11:20 today for an investor's call. Hope that you're announcing good results today. A few months ago, I think about 1 or 2 months ago, ABC had a country visit to the Philippines, and we had the honor of meeting the president and his a few cabinet members. And we were quite surprised when we were informed that the Philippines was opening itself to full foreign ownership in the banking sector. And that's bucking the trend of what's been happening in the region, where we are seeing a little bit more nationalism and protection of the domestic industry. I guess the first question will go to Mr. Ayala, to Jaime. You are the owner of one of the biggest, if not the biggest bank in the Philippines. How do you see this opening up? I would want to attribute the opening up because of your effort to lift barrier that the ABC produced last year. But we would like to get your insight. And how do you see this benefiting your business in the Philippines?
No, thank you, Patrick. Let me just start by saying that I, like many in this room, are a very big believer in everything that's happening in Asean. I think the basic, I'm always surprised when people look at very defined metrics. I think we should define ourselves by metrics as a way of giving some order to what it is we want to achieve. But I think everything that's been achieved within the ASEAN context, and I think the various ministers this morning pointed to the fact that many of the standards we're aiming for are almost hit. There's been a great movement to create a general standardization of rules and encouragement of intra-ASEAN trade that I think has been phenomenal. And to achieve that, there have to be a set of rules that we all, to a certain extent, live by. I think what you're referring to on the banking side, I think is a very welcome development in the Philippines. I think many of us, and I in particular, I'm a low tariff, free market, open market type person. I think this always competition always encourages effectiveness and brings out the comparative advantage of nations. I think as long as the rules are always the same for both the local players and the foreign players, then I think we all profit from it. I think the Philippines has progressed a great deal in recent years. I think it's wanted to be part of ASEAN and wanted to conform to the rules that we've all agreed to. I think opening up of the banking sector is something that has moved very quickly in recent times. It's been brought into law, and I think that is a good thing. I think with the entry of foreign banks who will now be able to own 100% of their operations, that were limited to 60 in the past, will come new research, new ideas, new investments. They'll bring their communities of investors with them. And even if we ourselves are in that sector, we've always wanted to basically live in a world of open markets and competition, and we hope that the rest of the ASEAN nations will also follow suit. I think if this can happen across different industries, then I think we'll all be the better for it, and I'm delighted that our country has taken this significant step in that sector.
Pahala, until recently, Indonesia was probably the most liberal regime in terms of banking ownership, but there has been concern that it's moving the other way around, that there's a new banking law that is being discussed in the parliament. And how do you see this trend? I mean, especially if we contradict between what's happening in Indonesia and the Philippines. Maybe you can shed some lights to this issue.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I think for us in the Indonesian banking system, we would welcome also foreign participants to come to Indonesia. However, I think we would like to be able to see similar steps actually being taken when Indonesian institutions like ourselves are actually trying to expand internationally. We believe that ASEAN is actually a big market, but Indonesia is approximately right now in terms of GDP, approximately about 45% of the ASEAN economic value. So we would like to be able to see that Indonesian players who also want to expand outside of ASEAN is also welcome. But in certain cases, what we have actually seen, that is probably not always the case. We've also seen that, for example, there are limitations in other markets, which are actually the threshold of foreign ownership in other markets is probably lower than that in Indonesia. So I think there needs to be some mutual, there should be some mutual efforts in trying to also communicate and engage the Indonesian institutions, including that of the Indonesian banking players, that there are steps actually are being taken outside of Indonesia, particularly in markets that Indonesians feel that are actually important, which Indonesia has a lot of trade activities between the two countries, or where there are actually many of the Indonesian workers are actually in that country. We'd like to be able to see that the government, as well as the private institutions, including the banks, are actually playing a bigger role in encouraging for that steps being taken.
Thank you. Jaime, I guess BPI is now highly welcome to participate in the Indonesian banking industry, that you have opened yourselves up to all players. Just shifting to Alex, knowing that you have to leave soon, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what's happening in the telecommunication industries? Are you seeing more opening up in the region of your industries? So what,
Thanks, Patrick. So I was here exactly about a year ago, and we talked about a few issues. And one of the things that we talked about is creating, the telecommunications players around the region need to really move fast, so we can actually facilitate better communication and movement of people in terms of communication across the ASEAN region. This hasn't happened too well. I think all of the shareholders, the boards, all the telco players have been reluctant to move in that way, and as a result, the substitute products, the OTT players and all that, with the price arbitrage are really winning the game. Now, the other thing that's also happening as a phenomena is a lot of MVNOs are actually appearing in different countries. So it seems that if you want to work well with another country, it's just better to open an MVNO in that country. And I think this is also a negative trend that would, in the long run, eat up the market of the telcos in those companies and eating up the margin. So, it's sad, that was one of the key topics that was discussed last year. And in terms of progress from the telco industry, it hasn't gone well. I mean, the competition, of course, remains very stiff, with data being, with the very low margin, is becoming very dominant, and it's not followed by a whole good ecosystem to support that in this region. We're only starting to see good signs for the past 6 months that a lot of application developers in the region are becoming more and more dominant, rather than importing a lot of the apps from the US, from Europe, which is kind of less relevant to what needs to be developed here locally. So, all in all, within the year, there hasn't been much progress, and it's taking a toll on us as players. All of the players believe that because the frequency is controlled, which is the most important resource, that there is this natural barrier of entry, but unfortunately the substitute products are there, and the quality is getting much better, and hence it's not looking too good, and we need to make a drastic move if we want to make things look better for us.
So what's your wish list for the next 12 months?
Well, I think we know there's been a lot of talks. It's at this 11th hour when everyone is seeing their margins going away that we're starting to talk, and there's a lot of collaborations within the ASEAN telco players. I think this collaboration needs to move fast. There needs to be an ecosystem where especially funders from this local ecosystem need to put more money and more effort into developing local more relevant applications, and this at the moment is not enough. Those are most of my high on my wish list. The last point, which is always very difficult, is try to get the governments of each country to reduce the regulatory fees. This is just too much at the moment, given the margins of where things are. It's just not sustainable. But this is an ongoing effort that all the telcos are fighting with each of their regulators.
Thank you. Tony, shifting to the airline industry, what is the likelihood of Indonesia and Malaysia having one national airline? Why don't we just combine our two airlines? Is it not possible? It's called Garuda.
That's a great idea. No, I think actually aviation has probably moved quicker in relation to the fact that it's probably the most regulated industry in the world than many of our other industry colleagues. If you look, AirAsia is in 4 ASEAN countries. Lion Group is in 2 ASEAN countries. Tiger Air was in 3 countries. It's withdrawn now. And Jetstar has been in a few. So the pace of liberalization is moving quite quickly. And I hope with ASEAN Open Skies that we'd be in a position also for common ownership. And I think that sets the momentum for airline consolidation, as been happening in Europe, where you see Air France owning KLM, British Airways now owning Iberia. I think it makes a lot of sense eventually to have 1 or 2 big ASEAN airlines than maybe 10 weaker ones. I think that's inevitable. So I think the next pace of reform after Open Skies has to be ownership within ASEAN countries, that they can own 100% of an airline. I think then there'll be an efficient distribution of capital. And the only caution I throw in the aviation sector is that Open Skies is one thing, but there are many other barriers. So you can say I have Open Skies, but suddenly you got no slots to land. So I think ASEAN also, and I didn't have enough time to say it in my speech, but I think ASEAN needs to have more institutions, which are ASEAN institutions, and also ASEAN standards. I think that's important. And in the aviation industry, we're trying to have a common ASEAN standard for a pilot. So if you know he has an ASEAN qualification, he's fit to fly in any of our ASEAN countries. I think that whole labor certification and standard certification is something I don't see ASEAN governments talk enough about.
Thank you. Now, shifting to Nazir, it seems that it's time to open up the great debate of reciprocity in the banking industry, since Pahala opened up the subject, and we are seeing what's happening in the Philippines, the whole sector being opened up. So what are you seeing in this space, in the banking space?
I think this issue of reciprocity, I think the point is every central bank will have its own timelines in terms of liberalization. And in the case of Malaysia, it is well documented and articulated in what we call the Banking Master Plan. And Governor Zeti sets out the next 10 years and says, when the new licenses will be issued, what foreign banks can do, etc. And she keeps to it, right? My concern about the current discourse in Indonesia is the potential change in ownership rules, which are then also backdated to the present owners. And I think we then run into this terrible space where, effectively our original investment is not protected, if you like. When we bought Bank Niaga in 2002, I remember, no one had bought a bank from IBRA at that point in time. We bidded, we searched Indonesia and found the most suitable one to be Bank Niaga. We approached IBRA at that time, and IBRA said, look, make a good bid, it'll be very competitive. And we did make a very good bid. And then I remember IBRA calling me up and said, congratulations, you've been shortlisted. So I said, great, who else is in the shortlist? He said, no one, it's just you. And so at that point in time, when we went in, no one wanted to invest in Indonesia. Indonesia was potentially going to be a failed state, so we took huge risks. Yeah, so today, to be prospectively told that we would have to then sell down this investment is pretty painful. Yeah, so I think what's important is, to look at liberalization in the context of what is needed for the national industry at that point in time. And similarly, Singapore has its own rules, Malaysia has its own rules, and all countries have its own rules. So when you And we, as we try and regionalize CIMB, we have to comply with whatever rules there are in each country. I think we forget that in Singapore here, for instance, we are also limited. CIMB is limited to having only 2 branches here in Singapore. Yeah. I don't blame Piyush for it. It really is in the rules that that is a limitation, and we try and do business within those confines in the knowledge that over time, as ASEAN evolves, ASEAN liberalizes, I assume Singapore will open up and be more liberal to foreign banks.
Pahala, can you share with us Mandiri's regional ambition? You're the biggest bank in Indonesia. You seem to be one of the few ones that have the aspiration of expanding in other ASEAN countries. If you can tell us a little bit more about your aspiration.
Well, I think our aspiration is really, for the time being at least, if we look at the ASEAN markets right now, there are really 2 markets that we think are very critical. Number one is how are we going to be able to benefit from Singapore as the financial center of ASEAN. And for quite some time, I guess, Indonesian institutions, particularly Indonesian banks, have not actually been able to take benefits of that, even though that we understand there may be some Indonesia-related financial assets that have actually been taking benefit from the development of Singapore as the financial center of ASEAN. So that is actually one of the things that we believe Indonesia, Mandiri as the largest bank in Indonesia, how is it? We do actually have some constraints, for example, in Indonesia in terms of how are we going to be able to fund for the future growth? And I think one of the things that we should be able to benefit is that how is it that we can take advantage of Singapore as the key financial center for Indonesia to be able to continue to grow? Because I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest constraints for Indonesian banking system to continue to grow is our loan-to-deposit ratio right now, which is approximately already nearing about 92 to 93%. That is one aspect that we'd like to be able to participate more. I think the second one is really about the Indonesian workers and also the Indonesian companies. As we see that more and more Indonesian companies are actually expanding regionally. We see now, for example, Indonesian companies that are reaching revenue of about $1 billion US, approximately about 80 of those right now. In the next 5 to 6 years, it will be somewhere at the range of about 150 to about 160. And more of these corporates are actually going to expand regionally as well. So there is also another aspect of Indonesian banks, Indonesian financial institutions will need to also be able to benefit from the Indonesian companies who are also expanding regionally. Whether they are actually to Myanmar, for example, we saw Cement Gresik who bought a cement company in Myanmar, for example, or any of the other Indonesian companies who would also be expanding regionally. How is it that Mandiri, as one of the key players in Indonesia, will be able to better serve those companies when they would also like to expand regionally?
I'm not sure why I'm on this panel, actually. It seems to be a banking panel. And maybe Piyush should take my seat here. I have to say, I love the bank guys. They're kind of all attacking each other, but being very nice about it. Aviation's not quite the same. It's more direct.
Shifting to this is probably it's a rare opportunity where we have CIMB, Mandiri, and DBS in one room. Going back to Jaime, one of the sectors that you have been very active is infrastructure, and there was paper that produced. And how do you see the progress that has been made in terms of like barriers being knocked down in the region?
Well, I think, Patrick, on that front, I don't have all the details of what's happening in ASEAN. I have a general feel. But I think progress has been made. But if you ask me personally, I think we have a long way to go. I think infrastructure is one of those topics that most of us in Asia, and I'm generalizing a little bit because obviously there are countries that are very advanced, are way behind the curve. I think the whole movement of growth in our region has led to natural constraints, and most of our countries have been slow to live up to addressing those constraints. Speaking for our own country, we've had this demand-driven growth led by consumers that's been there for quite a while. Our population has been growing in the Philippines, and our economy has been doing well, but we are, a decade or two where we should be on the infrastructure side. So this whole issue of harnessing what's needed on the infrastructure side, I think looking at some statistics, in general within the ASEAN region, we're spending about 3%, I guess, of our GDP on infrastructure, whereas the world average is about 3.6 to 4. We should move it up to a whole different level. A lot of it are natural constraints, I think, that governments face. I mean, the needs now are so much greater than ever before. I think there are issues around the large urbanization taking place in major cities in Asia, the Jakartas, the Bangkoks, the Manilas. We have populations now of 10 million, moving up to 10, 15 million in the greater metropolises. I don't think our governments are fully structured to be able to tackle the needs and flows of both trade, people in these areas. I think that the challenges are tremendous, and I think it's a major opportunity for all of us, both in the private sector and the public sector. So bottom line, I think there's attention put on it. I was in the panel last year on infrastructure. I think, we talked about some of the natural constraints, some of the tensions that exist between the private sector and the public in finding solutions. The public sector will always want to be careful about, not allowing the private sector too high a return for the risks they take. On the private sector side, obviously moving into this territory does involve risks that they have not faced in the past. Finding a commonality between the regulatory tension and the needs for private capital to get a fair return on the investment they put in is always there. That having been said, I think there is no greater challenge to our area of the world right now than to address the constraints to our growth, which is phenomenal in relative terms globally, by addressing tremendous infrastructure needs. I think we need imaginative solutions. I think we need a lot of work between the public and the private sector hand in hand. I don't think one group can do it alone. And the need for cooperation, not only in our countries, but across our countries. I think all these issues of aviation that are brought up in a humorous way, at the same time, they do point to realities we all face. I think the same thing is for shipping. We have to find ways of coordinating, cooperating, and issues of cooperation are not natural to us. I think our training and education is one to always seek to win at all costs. And I think we're living in a world now where cooperation is an asset and a skill that should be far more in demand than it is. I think as a grouping of nations, we have to learn to live in that, and I think if we can get that formula right, we really create so much more for ourselves than just fighting for each other independently. So bottom line, to answer your issue on infrastructure, I think we've got a long way to go. I think as countries we need to coordinate a lot more on what we need, and I think governments as well must be more and more comfortable allowing private capital to address the many needs that are there, and have to find a way to solve, I guess, the tension that exists both on the regulatory side and on the framework side to get private capital to be able to address these needs.
Tony, you had mentioned airport as being one of the challenges operating in Southeast Asia. Are you going to see more cross-border investments and opportunities in the airport sector?
I think if I just go back on Jaime's point, Piyush, you should take his place. Don't you think?
Piyush is always welcome on the panel.
It's a spare seat. Yes, I forgot Singapore's all one big happy family. Now you made me lose my train of thought. I think one thing that complicates ASEAN, and I'll come to the airports in a second, when I was listening to everyone earlier, is that government is so involved in business. If you look at Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, government owns a large part of the stock exchange. And hence, I think nationalism, protectionism, all comes into the issues, where I think Europe and America have moved forward from that. And so if you put people first, if CIMB can come in and create 100,000 jobs, then isn't that good for Indonesia? Or Mandiri can do so in Malaysia and Philippines. But I think it gets complicated in ASEAN because of government owning a lot of business. I've always said government should get out of business and should facilitate business. And I think that's the real challenge for ASEAN countries and ASEAN governments. So CEOs can really act independently and think what's best for their company. Going to airports, I think here you've got a classic situation. I think the majority of airports are owned by governments. Some may be on the stock market, but the major shareholders are still the governments. And decision making is slow. I think in Philippines and Indonesia, there's a severe problem, really a severe problem, both in Jakarta and Manila. And even Singapore, everyone's getting full. I mean, I told Ho Ching many years ago, Johor should be an airport for Singapore. She said, oh, you're way too ahead of your time. But to me, why can't Senai be an airport for Singapore? It opened up more competition for me, but that's the reality of ASEAN getting together. So I think, going back to Jaime's point, governments should allow more private investment to come in. In Malaysia, except for one airport, it's all owned by one company. Indonesia is the same. There is no private airports, really. Similar in Philippines, very few. So I think that's the big challenge. But underlying all of that is governments have to try and distinguish, are they regulators and are they facilitators of business, or are they in business? And I think that's the big challenge for ASEAN.
Nazir, do you share the same view?
No, I think take Tony's point further is the future of ASEAN is all about the collective improvement for 600 million people. And what inhibits that and what causes a lot of these non-tariff barriers is actually the intermediaries between to the public at large. And when the intermediaries are actually owned by governments, they become a lot more powerful than they ought to be. So I do agree with that. If you look at vested interests in various sectors, you'll see most of the prominent players are actually very powerful because they are government-owned or government-linked. Yeah, and I've said it before, but what's happening in terms of economic nationalism should have been expected because people were not really paying so much attention to ASEAN for many years, and suddenly, we're a year and a half away, and everyone's starting to get very edgy about what it means. So, but unfortunately, the truth is, ASEAN is nothing without Indonesia. And unless the new leadership of Indonesia steps forward and supports integration and takes the political risk of toning down economic nationalism, I think we're going to really fall short at the end of next year.
Pahala, we are only 1 year away from 2015, actually less than 1 year away. And Indonesia, as Nazir pointed out, will have new government coming in place on October 20th. In your observation, is there going to be any major change in terms of how ASEAN integration is perceived and pursued by the new administration?
I think so. I think in the last 1 year there has been a lot of discussions within the government circles about what is it that Indonesia will react to the ASEAN economic community. But I think I'm not too sure if that actually has taken many concrete steps in terms of allowing the Indonesian institutions to actually be ready for the opening up of the market. What we know is, in particular, I guess, in the financial service, in particular in the banking system, ASEAN Economic Community will probably not going into come into place until 2020, and I think there is certainly something that Indonesian regulators as well as Indonesian banking institutions are actually thinking about very carefully. What is it in the next 5 years that both from the banking side, from the human resources side, because of course, the ASEAN Economic Community not only has implications on the institutions per se, but also on the workers, and also from the regulator's point of view, what is it that the government needs to do in terms of making sure that the Indonesian institutions are also going to be as prepared and as as competitive when the market is finally going to be open for that.
Patrick, that's an interesting point, which I'm always arguing about in my own country, about being prepared. I mean, when is anyone actually really prepared, and what's that timeline? Until you throw yourself in the deep end. AirAsia never had a chance to be prepared. Temasek came along and started Tiger Air, and we just had to compete. Tiger Air wasn't blocked from coming into Malaysia, or Lion Group coming in. So I think the danger of hiding behind and saying, I'm not ready to take on the world, actually means you never may get prepared. And maybe because you're in an insular, if you compare myself with Malaysian Airlines, and maybe because they were in that, they didn't have to be as aggressive as we were in dealing with so many calamities, high oil, interest rate, etc. So I think that's a big challenge for government to remove crutches. And I think the losers right now are the people of ASEAN, because they're not getting the best products at the best price, because there are lots of inefficiencies being shielded from them. I think that's the big challenge, really. And to me, if there's a great company in ASEAN that can help all 600 million people, why not? I think the motto for ASEAN should be putting people first, but really meaning that. And all this intricacy of governments owning businesses, etc., and we're not ready, etc., I think slows down, and the people of ASEAN benefit. And the truth of the matter is, eventually Chinese banks are going to come in, Chinese airlines are going to come in, Indian airlines are going to come in, etc. Globalization is here, as I said in my opening speech. So I think that's a danger of saying we're not prepared yet, because when are we prepared?
I just want to say something. Particularly in the banking system, I think Indonesia is probably the most open market all across the ASEAN. I mean, I think if Tony actually mentioned something about being prepared, Indonesian banks have to actually be prepared right after the 1998 crisis. Because at that time, the Indonesian banking systems was totally open. I mean, foreigners can own 99% and can actually acquire any kind of banks in Indonesia. So I think for us, it's certainly something that the market has. I agree with Tony. The market has benefited a lot from the opening of the Indonesian banking systems at the time. I mean, the influx of the capital going into the banking system, the knowledge, the capability that foreign banks have actually injected into the Indonesian banking system certainly has been something that has been very, very beneficial. But I think at the end of the day, when we actually look at the market and look at how the different markets are actually allow foreign to actually participate, we see that there is actually some differences. And I think this topic about reciprocity actually come to places. And I think when there are certain differences, when one play at the end of the day, we believe that open trade is always going to be good for not only the consumers but also for the players. But when we see that there are certain differences, then people start to actually question, why is it that that particular market is not as open as this particular market where we have actually been operating. So I think that is the thing that we need to work together, as Tony has mentioned in the speech also, that not only the regulators need to actually take active participation, but if we see also other players in other markets are very encouragingly try to actually open the discussion with the regulators and say, hey, maybe we should have more participation from Indonesian banks, for example, in this particular market. That will help in developing trust and developing, I think one of the things that was actually discussed last year was developing alliances amongst banks, sort of like the star alliances amongst the airlines. But I think alliances can only develop if all of the players are actually trust each other. And trust actually built if we are actually seeing the other players are really trying to encourage and trying to actually develop the market so that the other players can actually participate in that particular market. So I think that is something that we would like to be able to see more and more, not only amongst the regulators, but also amongst the local players.
Very clear.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Firstly, on the reciprocity, I remember a bit cheeky, but I submitted a proposal to be your advisor to open your bank in Malaysia. And I still stand by it. We would certainly be pro-Mandiri opening in Malaysia, and I think clearly the Malaysian government wants Mandiri to come. It's just Mandiri has to abide by the same template that all other foreign banks need to abide by, which is, a limited number of branches for the first few years and so on. Secondly, I think, I'd like a better understanding of Indonesia's hesitation about ASEAN. Because when I look at it, when you want to regionalize your business, the first thing is to be strong at home, right? And Indonesia has the economies of scale for its multinationals to be very strong at home. Yeah, there will be phenomenal competition for in ASEAN. And if you look at it today, actually Indonesian multinationals have been very successful. Yeah, and if you look at some of those in the room, etc., have been very successful in other countries. And maybe it's because the Malaysians and the Singaporeans we tend to be government linked and we beat our chests, or we're narcissists like Tony Fernandes, so we say a lot of things about how successful we are. But if you look at it, the big Indonesian businesses.
Can you explain to her about what narcissistic means? And then look at yourself in the mirror.
If you look at some of the Indonesian businesses, they've been very successful. You look at the Salim Group and so on and so forth, extremely successful. So I think Indonesia has nothing to fear, everything to gain from ASEAN. Yes, economic integration means there will be some losers. Yeah, but we can't listen to the losers, right? We need to move forwards.
Jaime, you have something to say there.
No, I'd like to build on what Nazir and Tony have been saying. If one believes in what a united ASEAN can represent, then I think we all have to fight for the issues that Tony and Nazir have been saying. I give a lot of credit to Tony. He's he uses humor a lot, but actually he's competing in probably one of the toughest industries. And I'm always quite amazed at his willingness to fight it out in all our countries, the Philippines included. It's a great source of admiration. And I think to take Tony's spirit and the way industries have reformed around the kind of impetus he's given his own airline, I think is an example of the positive changes that can take place in all industries when you bring in competition. I just want to build on the two comments in the sense that in the Philippines, we've had some restraints as well and some of the issues that other countries face in terms of protectiveness and the like. But many of us, colleagues actually in this room as well, have used the whole concept of ASEAN to basically encourage our governments to move in the direction that we all would like them to see within the ASEAN framework. And that's something I think maybe we should all encourage. ASEAN is a great platform for us to put issues on the agenda. There will be governments that will be more left of center. There will be new leaders who will be more right of center. The ASEAN agenda is a chance for all of us to put these issues on the table. I have a colleague here, Bill Luz, who heads our National Competitiveness Council in the Philippines, who uses ASEAN constantly to put these issues on the table. I have Art Tan, who heads our electronics business that has a Pan-Asian footprint, and he uses ASEAN issues to go to our government and say, these are the issues we have to do to be able to compete. The whole concept of ASEAN is a wonderful platform to keep leading and pushing our governments to move to create a more competitive environment that conforms to what we all want to see. So I've found it a very useful platform in my own dialogues internally, irrespective of the leanings of our leaders, to put an issue in place that is good for all of us. And I would encourage everyone to do the same.
Thank you. It seems that in the past 45 minutes or so, we have been focusing our discussion on ASEAN 5, or the original 5 ASEAN members. Maybe it's time to shift a little bit to talk about the newer members of ASEAN. We got our guest of honor from Myanmar. If you don't mind explaining your group's plans and what you see being the opportunities in Myanmar and other regions in the greater Mekong area, that would be highly appreciated.
Well, in my case, we've been very grateful to the government of Myanmar giving us a first opportunity, and I speak only for our Ayala group, to have a chance to work with the local government on issues of water distribution and help create efficiencies. It is just a consulting arrangement at this time, an advisory one. But speaking for the Ayala Group and a Filipino company in Myanmar, we've been delighted, Mr. Minister, with the warmth that we've been received. We also have, with a great deal of help from Mr. Turako, an opportunity as well to get into the real estate market in a small way in Myanmar, and we're grateful for these opportunities. I think anything that creates cross-border flows, a broader understanding of how we can all work together, I think is a massive help. The same thing has happened with us. We're not the most regional of institutions, but we do have some global components. We've also moved into Vietnam in both the water distribution side and the real estate front. And as I said, in the electronics front, we do have a broader footprint that actually extends to China, where we have a number of plants. I find all of this very exciting. We're not looking beyond Asian shores as far as our groups are concerned. But we're delighted to see Myanmar becoming part and parcel of what ASEAN is all about. And of course, delighted to see the minister here today and delivering remarks and providing leadership in their own way to what's happening in ASEAN.
Nazir, I know that you've been there since 1994 and never left the country, so what's your plan now?
Thank you for marketing CIMB.
Another credit card for me from CIMB.
No, we have been in Myanmar in the former rep office uninterrupted since 1994. And I hope the minister remembers that when he evaluates our application for our license. Actually, I shouldn't allow Piyush to sit next to him. We just opened in Laos last month. We opened in Cambodia 2009. We've got 12 branches there. We expect to be in Vietnam shortly. So we're going to cover all of North ASEAN. We are committed to being in full banking in all of ASEAN by the end of 2015.
Tony, any Myanmar Airlines coming soon for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, I stand by what I said at the World Economic Forum. I think many ASEAN countries can learn a lot from Myanmar on its openness, its willingness to engage, and the fact that it's very liberal, both in its press and its political views even. We have been flying to all the airports that we can possibly fly to from everywhere. And you know, we've lived by the ASEAN motto, because we fly to every ASEAN capital and are connecting more and more ASEAN capitals. And hopefully we are in discussions one day to have a AirAsia Myanmar along with some of the other countries that have been mentioned. So our ASEAN adventure continues.
So, Pahala, are you going to sit next to the minister and start lobbying for your license in Myanmar after this? Is there such plan for Mandiri to expand in Myanmar?
Well, I think for us, we are still very small in terms of our international presence right now, we must say. We are only about 4 to 5% in terms of our international revenues. We would like, as we said just before, we'd like to focus on the original 5 first, and then, but we don't actually close the possibility of expanding into other members once we have developed some strength within the original 5 members countries.
Thank you. I guess before we open up the floor for questions, I would like to invite its panelists to make a closing statement. If start with Tony.
I think I've said a lot already. Pass it on to.
Well, maybe closing statement. I think it's no secret that part of my engagement as well with this forum and attending, I think, as many as I can, is that I'm a great believer in what we can do in ASEAN. I think private sector engagement, this is not, although the focus, I guess, globally has been put on a political process around ASEAN, I think all of us as businessmen are what going to drive a successful ASEAN. I think all of us being welcomed in each other's countries, opportunities being opened up, and all of us collaborating and doing things jointly is the way to go in the future. And once there is a commonality of interests on the economic front, I have no doubt that the rest will be a lot easier to get done.
Yeah, maybe I'll just wrap up by just reminding the participants that these sessions this year will be very important because what we will do is we will put together the LTB reports by sector, and we intend to quite forcefully present it to the Malaysian government that is taking the chair of ASEAN for 2015. The plan, as I understand it, is that Malaysian government will do a stocktake in January and then commit to what it wants to deliver by 31st December 2015. So very, very important that you participate and you give good ideas that we can push for this very important milestone.
Should we start with Bang Mandiri first, or are you ready with your closing statement?
Well, I might just say that really, I mean, I hope from this conference, and it's encouraging to hear what Nazir says, but the 2 times I've been here, there's been so much good talk and so many good ideas. I just think it's really important that Munir and the Secretariat get these ideas heard. And even within this, there's ABAC, there's us, there's so much rivalry and competition sometimes, which is kind of crazy to a simpleton like me. So I think the great work that's done last night, reading even the financial lifting the barriers paper, I didn't fall asleep. It was really well written. There's so many great ideas there. It's really imperative that these ideas get to the policymakers. And the very last thing I say is that, I think barriers are always there, but I think if we ourselves put down some barriers and be open to economic integration, the pie is much bigger, much, much bigger. The potential, and I'm living proof of it, from an airline in Malaysia to where we've gone. Everyone around this table, if they embrace economic integration, they may have a smaller slice, but the pie will be much, much bigger.
Pahala?
Well, I think the players within the sectors, like for example the ASEAN banks, Mandiri, CMB, Maybank, DBS, UOB, or OCBC, particularly as some of the players who has some regional aspirations, I think we should start to develop a level of common trust and be able to really communicate and really be able to understand each other better. I think that is one of the things, and we would like to be able to see each other that one is actually supporting the others when we are trying to develop our access into the markets that each of the participants are actually playing. I think that will be a critical part of developing some common and mutual understanding. And before we are going to be able to, for example, implement the recommendation last year of developing alliances, I think that is one of the most critical things that we need to be able to see. And we need to be able to see that other players are taking concrete steps, real steps to actually realize that. That's number one. Number two, beyond the players, beyond the industries, I think the regulators. I think a lot that Indonesian regulators can actually learn from the other regulators. And we would like, I think one of the things, for example, in Indonesia, if the regulators in Indonesia can learn and can really see that, for example, regulators from Singapore is really committed and is really serious in trying to help the Indonesian regulators in developing some policies, for example, in financial deepening, to deepen further the markets, I think that will also encourage and develop trust and also common understanding and the ability for the regulators to, okay, what is it that we can do to develop the so-called having a more open ASEAN markets?
Patrick, there seems to be a lack of trust amongst the regional banks. So AirAsia is prepared to sponsor a plane with all the banks.
All the bankers game.
And we'll take them to all the resorts in ASEAN for them to love each other more and trust each other more. That'll be our contribution to ASEAN.
Including us. We'd like to open the floor for questions. Piyush, you would be most welcome to raise your hand, as expected.
How come Jay only has 2 banks in Singapore?
Sorry.
Branches.
Thank you, Patrick. Jaime, I want to build on your point about the need for infrastructure investment and cooperation in Asia. President Xi Jinping actually initiated 2 major ideas. One in last October in Bali, and the most recent one is in Brazil with the BRICS Bank. And the one in Bali was even more relevant. He suggested the idea of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. So my question for the panelists is, how are you guys perceiving this idea? Would this provide the opportunities for the banks and the sectors like aviation, transport, telcos to really work together and as such give the private sector a bigger opportunity to participate in the inter and intra-connectivity building in Asia and in ASEAN? Thank you.
Jaime?
I don't know all the details of this bank. I've read a little bit about it, but in principle, I think at the multilateral basis, we should be coming up with new structures and new solutions to our needs in Asia. So bottom line, I guess I'd say I'm very positively inclined by it. I think we're living in a world with a set of rules that were defined a great deal of time ago under very different economic circumstances. I think the world has changed tremendously. And as a matter of principle, I'm a believer that we should have new institutions and new structures that should be built around the needs of today. There was a time when many of our countries were considered third world countries. They're now no longer that. And I think we need new multilateral structures that are created, I guess, to adjust to these new needs. So in principle, I would say that I'm favorably inclined to it, and I think anything that encourages a focus on building the infrastructure to allow us, I guess, to continue the progressive path that we're on as nations within the ASEAN area, I think is a positive one. So yeah, that would be my reply.
Yeah, very supportive of the idea. I mean, a huge concern as mine has always been that, you know, Asia invests so little in Asia. Yeah. And even a lot of the amounts that they do actually is routed through the West and all the friction costs of that. The only thing about this fund is that we need to go through the details. I think very, very important upfront to state very clearly that this fund will be independently and professionally run. There's some concern about the large contribution from China, which is welcome, but must be unconditional. Yeah, so we don't want to have a situation where there's a large infra fund and all the contracts go to Chinese companies. I think that's a sort of hidden hesitation. So if Xi Jinping can also come up and say that this fund is run independently, professionally, then I think, you know, we'll be very, very supportive of the idea.
I can guarantee you that the president of this new bank would not be, you know, for a long, long time remain of a certain nationality.
Okay. Piyush?
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Since my name's been taken in vain so many times, I am sort of compelled to offer a couple of comments. First, Tony, I'm actually quite struck by the amount of amiability, cordiality, and friendliness within the airline industry. Frankly, it had escaped my notice so far.
No, I never said there was. I said we don't pretend. These guys are pretending to like each other. We all hate each other, and it's known. You guys pretend to love each other, sit next to each other, etc.
In which case, I should be in the aviation industry. I don't pretend either. I guess also, second, your comment is right. It's a great thing that the panel after lunch, we can take some time out of, because that was the banking panel. Since that's already been completed, we don't need to get back on stage. I missed the morning session. I'm sure the minister spoke about how we're getting close to targets, 80, 90% there and so on. Perhaps more than that, anecdotally, I'm actually quite convinced that we're making progress. 4 years ago, Jay came to my office and told me DBS would get a banking license in Malaysia over his dead body. Yesterday, he said he'd be happy to have DBS in Malaysia because of his love for ASEAN. So that's clearly progress in 4 years. However, I do think, I was struck. Maybe we're hitting 80, 90% of targets. So, telecoms, we're missing the boat. Infrastructure, we have a long way to go. Banking, quite clearly the issues. So the reality of the matter is we can hit every metric, 80, 90%. We are a long, long way from where we need to be. That is the truth. Right? So there are two issues. You say, okay, what do governments need to do, and can we leave it to the governments? Both of you made a point that maybe there's too much government involvement. The problem in the private sector involvement is something which Nazir correctly said. The problem is one of winners and losers. The winners are people who think they can, compete, handle it, get on either because of force of personality, like our friend there, or because their starting positions are stronger, are very happy to run the race. But there's a whole bunch of losers who unfortunately have political clout, have a voice, and therefore, don't want to play the race because they're likely to lose. I think in that environment, leaving it to private sector and say, hey, private sector, bubble up, is going to create an environment where you can move this thing is frankly unrealistic and unlikely. So I have a view which actually goes that way, which means instead of minimizing the public sector role, maybe we need to take it and ratchet it up 2 steps forward, which is create a Brussels. And actually, if you wind up, this is the white mousetraps theory, you wind up and put the resources into creating and beefing up an ASEAN secretariat, but by industry. And you put X number of people in each category, and aviation, and this thing. If you're willing to commit to that, individuals, when they're in jobs, they've got to do something. So for their own self-preservation, people will be forced to try and drive the process, drive a few things, get people together and get some runs on the table, on the board. It just seems to me that the problem oftentimes is as much a problem of inertia and lack of focus as it is of protectionism and lack of intent. And therefore, just singular focus on an agenda, putting people with KPIs and point of view, will actually move the needle in many ways. What do you think of that?
I think the ASEAN Secretariat it's a little bit of an ether. I'm not really sure what goes on in there. And the leadership needs to really be strengthened. And I think on top of that, having sectorial leadership would, certainly drive the process. I think it's a fantastic idea. And I've been critical of what is the ASEAN Secretariat doing. And I think that needs to be looked at, and one of your ideas is a good idea.
The lady behind, Anu.
Thank you. I think 2 points. One on the infrastructure side that you touched upon. I was at the ASEAN Secretariat a few months ago at a PPP seminar that was co-hosted with ADB. And there was a lot of talk about how much money there is within the ASEAN itself that could actually pay the way for all the infrastructure requirements for the ASEAN within the next 10 years. Unfortunately, there's no access to it. And they talked a lot about public and private sector, partnerships. But unfortunately, in that room, there wasn't a single private sector player in that room. It was a lot of political, ASEAN Secretariat members and media, but no private sector. And the question is, when you ask for instance, I asked the ADB representative, I said, well, how do you engage with the private sector? They said, we go back to the usual suspects, and we have the usual suspects we go back to. Now, the reality is, the pool is much bigger than their usual suspect list, possibly. And therefore, from a private sector perspective, how do you feel that one could engage better with these agencies, or to move this forward? What would be the steps that the private sector could take? Because I know we talked about the ASEAN Secretariat just now, but at the ASEAN Secretariat, it's not a matter of will, it's also a matter of lack of funding. There isn't that much funding at the ASEAN Secretariat, and therefore there isn't as much power to move things forward. So obviously a lot of the work has to be taken up by the private sector. And just curious on your views on that.
Well, I could speak from a Philippine perspective, and obviously we host the ADB there, and I have noticed what you have said, that this whole issue of the private sector getting engaged to address public sector needs is, I mean, it has happened over the years, obviously, but it's not an example that's universally embraced. As I mentioned, there is this tension between a desire for government to make sure that private interests are not overly compensated for participation in an area. And at the same time, there's this tension on the private sector side, which is they see tremendous risks in participating in these public sector areas where political forces tend to come and play based on elections, and sometimes populist thoughts come in, and suddenly a contract that you had gets thrown out of a window. It's very, very tricky, but I think the role of the ADBs of this world and the multilaterals is to set a framework where they can play, I mean, it's just an idea, a middle person role to make sure that the integrity of the process is kept intact. I come from a personal belief, and perhaps it's colored by my view of the Philippines, where public sector resources are limited for the needs of the country. I mean, there are tremendous needs from everything from education to defense to infrastructure to, I mean, a whole host of things. There is a limit to what can be done. And so resource allocation is the name of the day. I've always argued in the Philippine setting that the public sector, the private sector has changed dramatically. The balance sheet of Philippine corporates is nowhere, it's at a whole different level to what it was a decade to 2 decades ago. They can participate now just like multinationals can. At one time, it was only multinationals who participated in this field. If the Philippines is a proxy for what's happening in Asia, there's a tremendous opportunity to harness private sector capital to address public sector needs. It has happened successfully in the Philippines when they privatized the water distribution of the city of Manila. I like to think as one of the parties that participated, it ended up with a result that ended up with a tremendous improvement in a public service, while at the same time giving a fair return to stockholder funds that were put in. If that model and a framework around a working model can succeed, then I think we have something that is tremendous. I think institutions like the ADB can play a very important role in making sure that the process is kept intact, and can play a middle role between public forces and private forces to make sure that there is coherence and longevity, I guess, to agreements that take place. The very nature, the negative of large infrastructure projects is that they're long-tailed. In other words, you know, these things are long-term investments, and lots of things can happen in between. I think, to go back to the ADB, yes, I think they should bring both parties into the room and can play, I think, a role in ensuring, I guess, that the system stays intact over a longer period of time than what we're normally used to. That would be just my thought.
I think you hit the nail on the head, really, because, and I think that's what this forum and this business club is about, is to try and get private sector's views into the decision-making process. I think that's where the big gap has. I had a session in Davos with a lot of the ASEAN ministers of trade there, and they actually were taken aback at how much work they needed to do when they heard from the private sector. But really, it's just trying to be heard, and I think, you know, Tan Sri Muni has a big job ahead to get us heard. But I think that's the key, is that generally we're not even invited into the forum, and so decisions are made without really engaging the private sector. But I think this is a big year for us, and it's great seeing so many people here because people are obviously interested. And just now I met someone who gave me a business card, head of ASEAN. It's the first time I've seen a title, head of ASEAN, within a multinational bank. So I think, ASEAN's becoming relevant, but I think the big task for Tan Sri Muni and the people at the ABC is to make all these good ideas and good work be heard by the decision makers.
Hi. Hello?
So,
Sorry, I don't think you can see me, I'm behind here. I know it's because I'm a journalist, but it's Jeremy Grant here from the Financial Times, if I may just punt two questions. Listening to the two big issues that are overhanging this panel, namely, it seems to me anyway, one is the government involvement in business, as Tony mentioned, and the constraints of getting private sector involvement. And the second being Indonesia's apparent reluctance, well not apparent, very clear reluctance on many levels to engage in ASEAN. It doesn't sound like this is really moving in the right direction, so I'd like to get a sense from the panelists of the risks to the ASEAN project now, because these are quite serious barriers, and you have protection has also been talked about a lot on this panel. What are the risks to ASEAN in the next year if there is no progress on these issues? And then secondly, specifically to Tony, do you think the Malaysia Airlines, or rather the Khazanah restructuring plan, which I'm sure you've had a chance to read, goes far enough, and would you welcome a revived Malaysia Airlines in your region?
Let me have a go first. I think it's important to look at it from the longer term context, and we are today, I think, in a position to say that ASEAN has achieved a lot with economic integration compared to, say, when we launched the Charter in 2007. What we're trying to make sure is that we achieve as much as we can by the end of 2015. And here, what I mentioned earlier about the rise in economic nationalism is actually very much within expectation. And if you look at the final leg of the EU as well, you remember there was a lot of economic nationalism towards the end as well. And to me, it's just a question of dealing with it. And dealing with it requires us to go into detail. And that's what this forum tries to do, which is to go into detail by sector. What are those outstanding issues that need to be addressed? And, frankly, I think it's clear to all of us that by the end of 2015, we will be well short of what was professed in the 2007 Charter. Doesn't mean it's a failure. It means that we had very, very high ambitions, probably too ambitious. But what we'll achieve will still be a great deal. And I think that's it's important for us not to forget that. But there's also the danger to me that if we don't have a reasonable amount of success, then the danger is that after 2015, whether there will be a pushback. And that's the other danger. We also focus on end of 2015. What happens if the arrangements, etc., are not sustained beyond that? What happens to ASEAN over the longer term, if that were the case?
I guess we just want to have one last question or remark from Tan Sri Munir.
See you later.
Thank you, Chairman. I think first, Jeremy's question about risks. I think there is one risk that has not been addressed sufficiently, and I think particularly also the panel's not mentioned. We have a problem with SMEs, how prepared they are, and how sort of scared they are of an open market, and how important they are to the ASEAN economies in terms of employment, in terms of the numbers of enterprises, and although in terms of export and output they're only about 1/3, but employment, critical, socio-economic problem. And in terms of their access to finance, still a perennial problem. And there must, on the part of the big ASEAN companies, be not a commitment, but an inclination to address some of these issues, particularly access to finance. And I think for us to relate, to government, we must also relate to the small and medium enterprises and show that we understand their problems and we have some solutions, creative solutions, for example. That's just the first point. And the second point, in relation to the ASEAN Secretariat, I think it's a dangerous thing to give the ASEAN Secretariat more money unless it is reformed. Otherwise, the money will just disappear down the big ship. And therefore, that reform is essential. However, it's going to take a hell of a long time for that reform to take place. There is a working group and so on, looking at the reform and so on and so forth. It will take a long time. And, it will be, I don't even think a sectoral, sort of leadership would make much of a headway unless the whole Secretariat is reformed. Leadership of the Secretariat is to retirees or those near retirement. They have no interest, in leading it because they have no career path, really, after, being Secretary General of ASEAN. The more important thing, I think, is so as to circumvent the insistence of member countries that everyone gives the same amount of money to the ASEAN budget, the thing to do is to give specific project funds for specific objectives, which essentially, to my mind, should be ICT-driven projects so that they can reach the people. If there is a decision made on the environment, for example, very often the ministers go back and they are pressured by their own pressure groups. When they go back, after having agreed, at an ASEAN meeting, they just go back and they have their own problems. But if the people get to know that there was an agreement on the environment about where you should construct cities, where you should not do so, and so on, the people within the respective countries will then pressurize their governments to keep to the agreements they have made in ASEAN. So the people ultimately will decide environment, goods, products, services, these benefits must be communicated in an effective manner to the people so that then ASEAN governments will have to respond to what the people say, and not just what we say, what the government say. And ultimately, it's going to be what the people say. And that kind of communication planning, I think, is quite critical to try and achieve some of the things that we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we have run out of time. Thank you very much for all the panelists and all the participants. A big round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you once again to our distinguished panelists.